Hi again. Here we are to continue our React Native exploration and continue working on our weather app. And what I'd like to do now is, now that we got the temperature showing up, what I'd like to do is have a view that shows all the weather data in here when we have the weather. And when we don't have the weather, I want to have a different view display that shows, maybe a loading indicator and a message maybe, right? So the strategy I'm going to take here is I'm going to make both of those two separate components. So I'll make one component that displays the weather, and it'll probably be a view that contains a few text elements and some other things maybe. And then the other thing, the loading indicator, will be a loading indicator, which is an object that React Native supplies for us, and maybe a text field that has a message in it. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the loading indicator here. So I've got the page open, React Native, and I'm looking at components here, and the very first one is loading indicator. So you can create an instance of loading indicator. You can give it some properties, so you can give it a color. You can say animating, and when it's animating, true, then it's spinning, and when it's false, it stops spinning, right? And I guess the color is an array. It takes a foreground and a background color. And then the size gives you a size object, right? So I guess you got to include, we got to read this, right? Passing another size prop is only supported on Android. Not quite sure. They don't really tell you. I guess the default is small, but you can pass something here to make it larger. Anyway, we'll give it a try, right? So what are we going to do here? Let's go get activity indicator, right? Let's make one. So we'll have to import it from React Native first. So we'll say activity indicator. And then down here, let's just see what it looks like, right? So we'll paste it in there and then run our code, and there's our activity indicator, right? So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to display the message and the activity indicator when there is no weather, and then when the weather shows up, let's replace it with a view to display the weather. So our first step here is this. Let's turn these two guys into a separate component, okay? So I'm going to go over to my components folder here and make a new file, and we'll call it loading message. I don't know. Let's make it lowercase. Okay, and then we'll import React from React, and then we'll import, we'll need to have text view activity indicator and style sheet maybe, right? We'll import these from, let me make this a little bigger here, React Native, and there we go, right? So now we've got our dependencies, right? And now we'll need to write a component. So this can just be a simple component. It won't have any logic to it, right? We can just pass in a message to say, what it should display, and then the indicator will just run when we have the loading message. So let's call this loading message. And we better pass some props in, right? And then, and there we go, right? So we'll have to return some JSX here. So maybe we'll wrap everybody in a view. And then we'll put the text above the activity indicator like this. And then maybe our message here can be props.message. And like I said, the activity indicator will just spin normally, right? So we better export this loading message, right? And then we'll probably need a style sheet. we'll just get it working first, and then we'll add the style sheet later, right? Because the style sheet can take some time, so we'll just get it working. So we'll add our styles here just to get started, right? So we have this style object, and we can start adding styles and applying them later. And there we go. So now let's go into our weather component again. And what we'll want to do is we'll want to import a loading message, right, from this folder. Right? And now we can use the loading message here, right? So I'm not going to use it yet though, because I want to swap between two, right? So now I need to have the weather display, right? So let's add another component now, new file, and I'll call this weather display.js. And we'll import React from React, right? You might wonder, you could copy and paste this stuff. I do that sometimes. Sometimes, though, I feel like if I type it, then I remember it. So, maybe it's good. I don't know. It does take longer, right? And sometimes I think, wouldn't it be easier if I could just import all this stuff as sort of a default thing? Maybe there's a way to do that. But anyway, so we'll import this from React Native. And there we go. So now let's make this, again, will just be a simple component. We'll call it weather display. It'll take some props. We can probably destructure the props, right? That might help us out. We'll do that later. And then maybe this should be inside of a view. And then in our view here, just to get started, we'll display the temperature maybe, right? Okay, so we'll put our temp in here, but that means we'll have to, take apart the props here. So let's assume that props has a weather property, right? So we'll say const, and then let's see here. Maybe we'll do this. Let's do const weather equals props dot weather. So let's assume that when we pass the props in, there'll be a property on the props object called weather, and that will be the JSON data that we passed in, right? So and I'm going to just do this the long way, but I'll just say temp here equals, and if I recall, it was weather dot currently dot apparent temperature. Oh, good. Thanks for the code hints there, right? That's kind of helpful, right? Anyway, and then we'll put our temperature in here. And I think this time, instead of concatenating and putting the degree sign, what I'll do is I'll Option K and I'll just put it right outside here, so it'll always be printed after temperature inside this text field. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And then I think now we need to export this. Weather display, and then we should probably set up a style sheet. There we go, right? So we'll skip the style sheet for now because this video is getting kind of long, so we'll just try and get this system to work. So we have two components, and what we want to do in weather, so I'm back in the weather component, right? So here I'm in class weather, right? And let's import. We got to import the weather display. So let's import weather display from weather display, right? And now what we'd like to do is down here, we would like to display the weather when the weather is available, and when the weather is not available, we want to use the loading message, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the weather right here, and if the weather does not equal null, then what we'll do, instead of getting the temperature, what we'll do is we'll render, we'll make a var here. Let's change this to, right? So we got our weather and we got the position. Why don't we change this thing here and say, let's say var child equals, and we'll set it equal to a loading message, right? And we'll pass in a message that'll just say loading, right? And so that's our, just a child object that we're going to display down here, right? I'm going to delete all this stuff. So now I'm down in return, right? I'm going to delete all this and put child there. So this will be our child object that we render, right? And if and we don't even need that anymore, right? So if the weather is not equal to null, then what we'll do is we'll say child equals, and we could kind of work the logic of this a little better. We'll clean this up later, but this is pretty close, right? This is going to be weather display, right? And remember, weather display takes weather as a prop, and we'll pass in the weather data from our JSON, right? So, if we'll just make one of these and it'll get displayed, but if the weather's available, we'll make a new one that's a weather display, and then that'll be displayed down here. So let's give it a try, right? Let's see what happens. We'll refresh our page, we're loading, and the weather displays, right? And then from there, you could build into your weather display all of the different, components of the weather that you want to display, and you could arrange these and style them in here. And maybe you even want to make some subcomponents, but in our main weather component, the structure will be very simple because there'll just be one component or the other component that's displayed inside, right? So anyway, so hopefully that gets you started setting up your weather display and getting the weather to show up on the screen, okay? So thanks for watching, and then let me know if you have any questions and continue working on your project.